Hey Jordan, how's it going? What's up?
What's up, Rob? How are you?
I'm all right. I'm been doing a lot of hell diving. I'm still deeply into that, deeply invested in that. In the robot war, the pushing back the automaton menace. I've been through some crazy shit this week, some crazy experiences. I'm still kind of trying to readjust to civilian life. You know, it takes time. You go back to civilian life and you're in your big comfy bed, you know, it doesn't feel right. You want to go on the floor, the hard floor. It's just strange. I'm hearing sirens and stuff going off. I'm wondering if there's bots cresting over the hill.
It's triggering for
you.
Yeah.
It is, actually.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your service.
You're welcome. No problem.
I got messaged on Discord today by a recruiter by the name of Ricky asking if I'm ready to enlist again. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you have to do your patriotic duty. You have to defend Super Earth. That's under all kinds of different threats right now. And we need, like I was saying in the previous episode that we did with Ricky, you know, whether it comes to you, whoever's listening, we need all hands on deck here. This is serious. We need everyone to contribute to this war effort. You know, I'm going to be back doing another tour again soon myself. So, you know, it's, I know it's not easy. It might not be what you want, but it's like, it's called doing your patriotic duty to defend Super Earth. So
it's the price of freedom, and
exactly.
We all need to do our part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to spread liberty and democracy throughout the galaxy. Is there a more noble endeavor? I would say no.
I agree. I'm inclined to agree. I liked our conversation with Ricky earlier this week. Subscribers who have listened to it, I hope you enjoyed it as well. It was really fun. We talked about that game, Helldivers, and how that has reignited a conversation around Super Troopers, Paul Verhoeven's 1997 sci-fi parody and satire movie. It was enjoyable. I watched it for the first time this week. Hilarious. I've been thinking about it ever since. And we got into the message of that movie, how it informed foreign policy in the U.S., especially over the next several years, or predicted U.S. foreign policy over the next several years.
Yeah.
Really good, really fun conversation with Ricky. You can get that at insurgentspod.com. It's just $5 a month. You get access to that episode and all of our premium episodes. You get an additional episode every week for $5.
It's a pretty good deal. You know what? I'm really proud of the bonus content and really just overall like the kind of what we've been able to do on this program for like going on 4 years now. And it's like we're looking around the media landscape and seeing all these massive big brands falling apart, firing people. Vice is the latest example of this. Vice, like 4 years ago, was valued at like $6 billion. And now I guess they can't even have a website. They can't even afford to have a website. They just fired several hundred people. It's absolutely insane what is happening to the media landscape. And you know, I feel really fortunate. That I'm able to you know, work in independent media a little bit, and I'm able to support myself, and I don't have to be involved with one of these like media brands relying on like an influx of VC cash and these vultures coming in and trying to turn it into some like profit making machine. You know, so it's once again, I'm thankful to be able to be here doing the work that we're doing, and the fact that there's a little audience out there listening to it, and we're not at the whims of these kinds of like unaccountable financial interests.
It sucks because Vice has been a site that I've appreciated for my most, if not all of my adult life. It's produced some of my favorite articles, and just the writers there having such a long leash to do creative, unique pieces and work that no other outlet really could hold a candle to. Just
Yeah.
I think often I even message Justin Cafier, a friend of mine. He's a freelancer and did a piece for Vice, God, several years ago at this point. And I go back to it all the time because it's hilarious. And he just talked about boofing cocaine. And he did, for the piece, he did it, which is he just blew coke up his ass. And it's such a funny piece.
Nice.
And I messaged him, if this site, which they say they're going to shut down, I said, if this article disappears, I'm going to kill myself. So I'm not messing around. I want to go back to that every like 6 to 8 months and reread it.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the first like major publications that I was able to get published in. I had done a few things, writing about music mostly because that was kind of what I had experience in, and I was trying to expand and trying to get my name out there. And being published in Vice Sports was like a huge deal for me. I wrote this piece about the Torture Chamber Pro Wrestling Dojo in Montreal, and I spent like a week or two hanging out there, watching all the students learning how to wrestle, and it was an amazing experience. And it really like helped me increase my profile and the audience that I had, and kind of was a big part of like putting me on the path that's led me to what I'm doing now. So it's sad. It's sad that all these kind of like media outlets just keep kind of dropping, that they can't kind of figure out this formula. It's just, there's been too many examples to name now. Vice is just the latest, but again, that's why I'm thankful to the audience of this show. I'm thankful to the people that pay attention to the stuff that I do, that allow me to continue being able to do this kind of work, and with not a huge amount of security, but definitely like I'm not worried about a venture capitalist firm coming in and just like firing both of us and replacing us with like AI or something like that.
Yeah, you know? AI or Ken.
Yeah, that would be even worse, really.
I'd rather be AI.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I hear you. Being independent and listener supported is a very precarious situation, because, you know, people might unsubscribe if they don't like a guest or a topic or whatever. Some people just might not ever subscribe because they don't want to. And I think just, you know, we've made the case before, like we would argue it goes beyond just this show. And this isn't something you're going to hear in a lot of pitches or asks for people to subscribe. It's the reality though. Like, you see a lot of small independent creators or outlets or shows struggle and eventually shutter because people don't or can't subscribe. And I understand that it's challenging, but if you can, you help create a more robust ecosystem. And I think when you look at the right and how well funded it is, that you can just basically go and do one stunt, making fun of trans people, making fun of immigrants, doing something heinous that gets attention. Within a week or two, there's some right-wing enterprise that's well-funded, often funded by a billionaire or special interests or the fracking industry, willing to give you a show and a platform and a stable source of income. So that's what the left is up against, and I think a lot of people are conditioned to always accept or understand or see the news and content and most of what they get as free, and it's just, that's unrealistic. So like I'm saying, it's not just our show. If you can subscribe, that's great. I would argue you also should, if you can, subscribe to a handful of progressive and lefty and independent outlets and enterprises, because we need a more robust ecosystem, because we're not going to obviously reach everybody. Jacobin's not going to obviously reach everybody. All of these shows together can reach more and more people, but they need resources, they need infrastructure, they need the ability to do that. And this is a people-powered effort. So if you can subscribe to us, that's great. If you can subscribe to several, that's even better.
Yeah. I think it's most important that people subscribe to this show, though. I think ideally for the future health of society, really, I think that's what...
The future of this country, our democracy hangs on
it's
you
at stake.
Subscribing to this
Exactly.
show.
I know. I was just going to say, imagine if some like fracking billionaire would just like pay us $75K a year to just talk about like Disney cartoons or whatever these guys do. That must be nice.
I can't believe
that's a great gig.
What? Yeah, what a life. And then these guys like whine about other people and like
I know.
mock people for getting laid off.
What are you
It's
complaining
insane.
about? They're like, no one wants to work anymore. Like that's literally your job, is just to complain about like woke non-binary characters in like Pixar movies or something. Like that's all you do all day. I don't know.
45
These are the rugged,
the Daily Wire's senior mermaid correspondent.
These are the rugged, manly men, conservative individualists, you know?
Masculinity is dying.
Exactly.
And here's why Lilo and Stitch is too woke.
Jesus. Yeah, get a real job.
Well, speaking of shitty media stories, another one today that is worth mentioning. So he has not been on the show, but he's somebody I've talked to online for years and somebody whose work I think everyone has seen. If you have seen the Sinclair News video where it shows all of the local Sinclair station anchors reciting the same script, that was made by Tim Burke, otherwise known as Bubba Prague on every social media outlet. I hope you follow him, but you've probably seen his stuff. In 2022, he helped facilitate a series of stories where raw footage from Fox News Studios was published in Media Matters, I think maybe Vice, and Daily Beast, and a handful of others. And this was a result of Fox broadcasting this feed online, unprotected, no security protocols, nothing any user needed to bypass. It was just out there. If you could find this link, you would have access to it. So he recorded it and shared it with media outlets. He did nothing wrong. It's just like visiting any other site and screenshotting or screen recording any other site and then handing it off to the news. Yeah. Nothing wrong.
Like that's on them if they've not secured that feed.
It's their stupidity.
That's their fault.
Right.
Yeah.
So they threw a fit. They issued a legal threat and I think a challenge and went after him. And then his house was raided last year. They took all of his devices. This guy had a crazy setup for screen grabbing sports clips and news clips, and he was a consultant, and he did a lot of work. So it jeopardized his ability to work. Now today, there was a 14-count federal indictment. He was indicted by a grand jury, charged with 1 count of conspiracy, 6 counts of accessing a protected computer without authorization, as all the facts show that is bullshit, and 7 counts of intercepting or disclosing wire, oral, or electronic communications. Again, the facts of this case negate all of those charges. It's totally bullshit. I'm not a lawyer, but I know it's bullshit just by reading the facts of the case and just by understanding what happened from people who are close to the story, from him himself. It's all fucking bullshit. So if you are outraged, and I argue you should be, and you want to show him some support because he's going to be up against government lawyers, I'm sure Fox is going after him, timburkelegalfund.org. We'll put that link in the show notes. You can chip in a few bucks to help pay his legal bills, which I'm sure will be insane. I would hope some of these organizations that benefited from his material also chip in, but this is a very serious threat against somebody who, again, did not break the law. He accessed a public website, which anybody could do.
Once again, the defenders of free speech and free expression have showing what their values are really all about yet again. And it's funny you mentioned that video of all the Sinclair talking heads using all the same language. It's funny how that's kind of gotten a second life with all these conservatives discovering it and taking it out of context of like what Sinclair is and what their whole platform is, and trying to make it about like liberals or wokeness or whatever, and being like, no, that's you guys. That's you. Yes. Like Elon Musk sharing it and be like, well, this is so concerning. We're looking into this.
Dystopian.
Yeah, exactly. This is your shit, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I do hope people contribute to the legal fund. I can't imagine that's a great position to be in. So yeah, I hope that that works out and that is exposed as being a bullshit, frivolous lawsuit. But I think when big corporations engage in lawsuits like that, or like that kind of lawfare, it's not even always about winning, but it's just about sending a message to people about, what happens when you try and fuck with them. So, and for most normal people, they don't have the financial stability and security to confront that when you're dealing with a massive corporate conglomerate in that way. So I hope it goes okay as well. What's going on in this next conversation you're about to have? Why don't you clue me in on that? Once again, I'm in the dark about what's going on in my own podcast.
Secret conversations.
Oh boy.
It's a smoke-filled conversation with Hunter Walker and Luppe B. Luppen, otherwise known as NYC Southpaw. They have a new book called The Truce, Progressives, Centrists, and the Future of the Democratic Party. I read it over the weekend, and it was a really fascinating look at the jockeying between the Biden camp and the Bernie camp and the broader progressive world post-primary going into this administration and carrying on into today. We talk about the book and how this book serves as a roadmap for future challenges and inter-party challenges going forward. One of which we talk about it at the end, and as Hunter brought it up, I wish we could have spent more time on it, but stick around for the end, because the makeup of the primary schedule, as they point out in this book, is going to be a cyclical fight in the Democratic Party every 4 years because of how they've structured revisiting when states have primaries. But then these state governments, especially in these purple states, many of them have right-wing state legislatures and right-wing control. They're not going to enact changes to their state laws about when these primaries happen. So the Democratic Party is setting candidates up for really delicate, like tightrope acts where they have to determine whether they even campaign in primary states and risk having their delegates like removed or not counted or not being treated as like equal or whole, or going into like a challenge where maybe you have to compete in a couple states where you don't really have a shot. It's going to be such a mess. And I wish we would have spent more time on it, but there's a whole chapter in the book on this that I thought was really fascinating. The book is called The Truce. Our conversation was really fun. I would encourage everyone to pick it up. And you want to get into it?
Let's get into it. I'm looking forward to it as well.
All right. Hunter and Luppe will be joining me right after this. And now I'm joined by Hunter Walker and Luppe B. Luppen, authors of the new book, The Truce, Progressives, Centrists, and the Future of the Democratic Party. Hunter and Luppe, thank you so much for joining me. How are you both?
Hey, man. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Doing well.
Hunter, I believe we've asked you before, but I'll have to refresh my memory. But Luppe, we ask everybody who comes on this show the same question, just so we know who we're dealing with, whether or not the conversation should continue. And now it's your turn. Luppe, are you a gamer?
I am a former gamer. I did it quite a bit going through college and law school. I don't do it as much anymore, but I miss it sometimes. And if this means the end of our conversation, I do apologize. But I was a big gamer for a while and probably not any good at it anymore.
I think it's a once always situation. You're baked in, you're grandfathered in, you're fine. The conversation can continue. But what did you play? That's what I want to know.
A lot of Counter-Strike, a lot of Doom. I'm an old done man. So Doom, Counter-Strike, Assassin's Creed. I got my start on King's Quest, man. I was playing King's Quest on the PC Junior, typing in the little text entries,
Okay.
That was most of my experience, and then a lot of Mario Kart, and sort of towards the end, the Wii games, the Mario Kart, and the more fun stuff. But after that, I had to go be a lawyer, and and there's no time.
Not a lot of time
for gaming after that.
No, it kind of kills the soul. You can't let your inside gamer flourish anymore.
That's true. The husk of the man you see before your days, thanks to Big Law.
And Hunter, if I remember, you were a Switch guy, right?
Yeah, so I got big on the Switch during the pandemic. My latest thing with that is I'm actually using the Switch game that they have to try to learn Yu-Gi-Oh cards, because you can actually play on Switch. And as you know, Jordan, I have trouble keeping up with the Magic rotations, man. They overwhelm me. So I've been trying to find a game with a more static collection. And then also I moved to Brooklyn in the past year, and I've been setting up the man cave. And down there I've got all of the little mini retro consoles. So like
Oh,
retro Game Gear, the PlayStation one, which is actually really surprisingly bad. And then the one that has become my favorite is the Super Famicom, the
okay.
little retro edition. And this is the basically Japanese version of the original NES, I think. So it's like really, really old original Nintendo games, but some of them are Japan only, and the themes are just bizarre. Good luck with the instructions. But it is an absolute blast. So I'm just really enjoying that. And I can't even tell you what half of what I'm playing is called.
Oh, that's fun. I like that. Yeah, I love the mini retro wave. That it seemed to have disappeared. They had this like run in the late 2010s where every year or two they would do another one, and everyone was expecting an N64 one, and I don't think that ever came.
Yeah, I think the Famicom might be the newest one, but it was Japan only. But you can get them here, and I really dig it. There's a store near me that has an N64 for $100, and I am very, very
Oh,
tempted for GoldenEye alone, obviously, and Star Fox. I need some Star Fox.
both are classics. You know, they re-released GoldenEye on Switch and on Xbox, and I tried to do a couple of levels of the campaign, and I don't know if I was just not feeling it that day, but I just had this moment of this realization. It's like, was this game only good to me in my mind because I was like 8 years old? Because this sucks. This
Well,
is not fun.
the campaigns were never the thing. That was like the
Yeah.
sleepover battle game.
Right.
That
It was
was
always the
yeah.
multiplayer. Yeah. Have you guys watched the GoldenEye speedrun guys on YouTube who are just going through the campaigns as fast as possible? And it's like,
No.
it's turned into this like weird martial art where they're like, they're like running out while throwing 3 grenades at the helicopter before they can see it. And they get through each level in record. They're trying to beat the record times, but it's like it's evolved into much more of like a racing sport and choreography than like dealing with a first person shooter.
And
I
someone
love
said
that.
America isn't already great.
So let's get into the Truce. I read this over the weekend. It was a great leisure read as I sat on the beach, and I couldn't put it down. I enjoyed it, and there have been books that I've worked through on this topic over the past few months. Some have been primarily from the perspective of the Biden campaign, the Biden administration. Others have been from the perspective of the squad and its members and really close contact with some of the squad members. I think what you guys did really well was provided a holistic approach, a holistic view of this same moment that other books have tried to capture in a way that I thought was comprehensive, that spoke to varying perspectives, not just one group who they had access to, whatever. I just really liked being taken through these moments as you illustrate the dynamics and the conflicts between what many see as kind of two competing factions within the Democratic Party. And I'm wondering if for people who aren't familiar with it yet, if you would be able to provide the listeners with a brief overview of what this book is, what it's about, why you both decided to write this.
Well, first off, thanks so much for taking the time to read it and for having us on. Um, this book in many ways actually started during the Paul Manafort trial. Um, Lupe and I had been friends in New York, but I got sent down to DC to cover Trump. I didn't see him for a couple years. And he was always, Lupe is perhaps better known to the internet as NYC Southpaw. Twitter's favorite pup dog lawyer. And he had this account where a lot of people just didn't know who he was. But he was offering just some of the most brilliant political analysis and reporting you could find under the guise of an anonymous puppy. But I had met him many years ago, and it was so funny because it was like Luppe walked into this media party, and it was like, "There's Southpaw, like that's really him." And we were friends, but we didn't see each other for a couple of years. And then I walk into the Manafort trial, and there's Luppe. And this was crazy because, while he was Southpaw, he was sort of a corporate lawyer on the side. That was his day job, let's call it. And so I was like, "Man, what are you doing here?" And he was like, I'm thinking about, going off to become a writer. And I'm watching this trial. And I was like, "Well, dude, we've got to write about this together," because he's just like such a sharp legal mind. And, I had experience covering Trump. So we started covering the Trump administration through the Mueller probe, and it's fizzling out basically. And I think one thing that we noticed was, there was this avalanche of attention for Trump, this pile of Trump books. And obviously that story was important. I devoted years of my life to covering it. But Trump's tendency to kind of take the oxygen out of the room meant that no one was paying attention to the story that was going on the other side of the aisle. And, it was extremely important as well because, essentially, as Trump was threatening the American order and our democracy as we know it, the opposition party was going through their own identity crisis. You had Bernie Sanders and this sort of rise of the new left, and that question of who they were going to be and who was going to lead the party just was totally unresolved during the Trump years. So that was a story that we set out to tell. And I think you rightly identify that in compiling what I think turned out to be a history of kind of the last half dozen years or so in the Democratic Party and what that means for the next campaign in the next couple of years, we really found that there's a wide spectrum. Everyone from the DSA on to Joe Biden, and then really to the right of him, you've got sort of your Josh Gottheimers, your Joe Manchins, and what we called the radical centrists. And I think a lot of the scant reporting, frankly, that we get on the Democrats oversimplifies that dynamic. It either ignores the fulsomeness of the left and reduces that to quote unquote woke, or it, treats Joe Biden simply as a centrist without acknowledging where he's been surprisingly progressive and without acknowledging that there, is a pretty right-wing center of the Democratic Party. So we really tried to do a complete top to bottom survey of the whole thing and to do it in a way that gets in the color and the characters and hopefully can keep people kind of entertained and turning the pages as they learn a lot about where things have been and where they're going.
Absolutely right. So this is Lupe, and thanks for having me on as well. And thank you, Hunter, for the kind words. I'm NYC Southpaw for my sins online. And we did meet in a courtroom in Alexandria in 2018, watching Paul Manafort's trial. I was actually doing some research in the Library of Congress across the river for a different project. And I just took the morning off to go watch Paul Manafort. And I think the one thing that I think about a lot is that we're not prophets. We didn't see the future in 2018, and we were super interested in the progressive movement and the impact it was going to have on the Democratic Party going forward, and that that the roads from 2018 were quite open. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think, was either had just been or was on the verge of being elected. Bernie Sanders had this huge movement that had lasted through the campaign and had caused all sorts of disruption in the Democratic Party. We argue in the book that it was, the Sanders campaign's energy was a big part of the reason we saw sort of lower participation rates in the general election in 2016, could explain some of why Trump won that election. And so following the progressives' trajectory through the Democratic Party seemed like this really incredibly important story, one that in 2018 I didn't know enough about. Really felt like I didn't know enough about who the major players were and how that was going to play out. And so this process for me has been one of trying to talk to everyone we we could through the Democratic Party and really track what happened. And it turned into a really fascinating story of the party kind of getting its unity back together, forging what we call the Truce, this sort of fragile alliance between progressives and the Democrats they'd once sought to displace. And we found that Barack Obama had done a lot of that, and we found all these other factors, and then we also just found a ton of really interesting stories on a smaller scale about like what had happened in Iowa on that night when there were no caucus results and what was going on in the Sanders campaign. And so we thought those stories made for a compelling narrative, and we tried to weave them together to sort of tell how the progressive movement found itself in this sort of alliance with Biden, and how Biden was able to pull together enough of a coalition to win. And to have the presidency he's having.
And can I just say, this is totally unrelated to the book, but I just popped into my head, and it's one of my favorite memories. If you remember, the Manafort trial kind of hinged on his kind of this outrageous pile of money he'd earned from his foreign wheeling and dealing. And they famously had like the ostrich $10,000 jacket and whatever. And, while he was basically trying to argue that, everything was above board and he was a totally normal, legit guy. At one point, I worked my way up into the front row, and his wife was sitting there watching the case on her seat cushion from a luxury box at the Rio Olympic Games. So you always got to go out and report in person. You might meet your book writing partner, and you might get to see the Rio seat cushion, undergirding the pleading of poverty.
So I love that. You kind of threw me there. The story that it was sad, especially, I mean, we're just past the 4-year mark, but the Iowa caucus night, I totally forgot until you both reminded me in your book about how chaotic that night was. Their app, everyone, the Democratic Party and the caucus, they had their own app, and then the Bernie campaign had their own app to also try to track results, so they had a better idea of what's going on. In both, just didn't work, and it was just madness. You had some really interesting stories and funny anecdotes from the watch parties and the war rooms, or wherever their bunkers on caucus night. And just the meltdown as the Bernie campaign realized all of their efforts and their strategy, which hinged on winning Iowa and riding that momentum, wasn't going to materialize. And as they started to realize as the election went on that this wasn't happening, Faz and a few others started to realize, okay, well, how can we shape this administration? How can we shape some of the policy? And you talk about this commission. And one of the things that Faz did, I think it was Faz, that you guys say was a meaningful ask, was that they both sides should sign off on participants of these committees, or this committee and this commission.
They were called the Unity Task Forces. Yeah.
Right. That's it. The Unity Task Force. And these policy prescriptions, I mean, what you're talking about, even though I think a lot of progressives and leftists are upset that it hasn't fully materialized, the fact that Biden is talking about student debt cancellation, the fact that Biden is talking about many of these things that were unthinkable 5-10 years ago for a mainstream Democratic politician, especially a presidential candidate or a president, to talk about, that is change. And I don't think a lot of people can wrap their heads around it because it hasn't fully materialized, hasn't been fully implemented. This utopian view that a lot of people have is nowhere near reality. So they ignore all of this work that the Bernie campaign fought for after losing Iowa. I mean, in some of these conversations, was there a sense of frustration from people in the progressive world who fought for those changes that their efforts were not being recognized?
This book involved hundreds of interviews with people at every level of democratic politics, from your socialist activists in the streets to city and state legislature members, White House officials, and then Bernie Sanders himself. And one of the big questions I think people out in the world have is kind of, how did we end up with Joe Biden? just, there's weakness in his polling. He's old. I mean, it just, and I think everyone recognizes the stakes of the last election and the current one, and sort of how did it get left in his hands, right? And I think a big part of that story was COVID. Because I was out on the trail in 2020. I was there for that night in Iowa and that collapse. And, I think people forget how much in the early days of the 2020 primary, particularly around Nevada, even after the Iowa fiasco, Bernie seemed like maybe he really could win, right? And so we tell the story of that falling apart. And Iowa, I mean, it's just really amazing. There was a lot, that we were able to report for the first time from the fact that, you know, Bernie's team had their own app that collapsed at the same time as the state party app collapsed. Part of their strategy to win was this thing that involved these like crazy telephone caucuses, including one in like a freelance journalist's living room. And then my favorite story of all is that after this blow up in the war room and all this technological chaos, Bernie actually ultimately got the Iowa delegate that was in dispute between he and Pete Buttigieg in this backroom deal making at the convention that just had never been reported before. But it's one example, I mean, it's a particularly fun one, of the behind the scenes engagement that was taking place between Faz Shakir, the remnants of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and the Biden team during 2020. And, I think I would add to your explanation of it, Jordan, and say that it wasn't just coming from Faz and the Bernie folks. There was a real intentional effort on the part of Joe Biden and his team to kind of reach out to progressives and build with them. And part of that, as we report in the book, came from Obama, who was just, had almost PTSD after 2016, believed the Hillary and Bernie rift was really what gave us Trump, was very focused on the youth vote and was sort of urging, and working on his own too, to try to kind of mend the fences there. And the Biden team did that as well. And the unity task forces were a big part of that. And those task forces, as well as other allegiances, I mean, the truce in our title really refers to this, helped make Biden surprisingly progressive. And frankly, when we set out to write this book, we really were initially more focused on Bernie and AOC and that wing of the party. But I think Biden kind of surprised us and changed the definition of what progressivism means right now. But what's kind of interesting, and I've talked to a lot of progressives in the past couple of weeks about this, Biden was to the left of Obama on a ton. He was to the left of really the campaign he ran, where he put himself out there as kind of a moderate alternative to Bernie. And yet, in spite of all of that, he's to the right of Obama on Gaza, and certainly to the right of this coalition that he took all of this care to build. So I think we're in this really interesting moment right now where our book is the story of how Joe Biden was able to pull off this almost improbable win by healing Democratic divisions and building this sort of motley coalition. And right now, that thing that was so crucial to fending off Trump is, completely at risk.
Right, I'd agree with that. I think there's to both of your points. There's this, I think, tendency in progressive politics to sort of feel like it's always going nowhere and everything is a tragedy, and there's a lot of evidence for that. But there's also a lot of like gains that sort of are just, to my mind, kind of pocketed without a lot of celebration from progressives. The Democratic Party has moved toward the progressive movement. If you track, the presidential campaigns of like starting with Al Gore and John Kerry, Barack Obama, and you get to Joe Biden's campaign, you really see that like on tons of issues, the politicians are moving toward progressives, and they're doing it because they need to, because progressives are flexing their muscles. They flexed them in 2016. I think that's one of the main arguments we make. And so you do see Biden reaching out, but Joe Biden also comes from a much more traditionalist, centrist, if you will, grounding in politics, one of the things that we report, one of the stories I found most striking, is that he called Andrew Cuomo at the beginning of the 2020 race and basically argued him. And remember, this is Andrew Cuomo in like the sort of COVID highs of his career, when he's doing daily press conferences, is still beloved, hasn't been racked by scandal. And Biden talks Cuomo out of running. He says, if we both get in, some nut is going to win. And he's clearly referring to Bernie Sanders in that moment, I think. And, you know, he sees the progressive leadership as oppositional within the party and nutty. And yet, through this process of politics and this sort of brute force of what progressives have been able to accomplish in the last several cycles and their power with young people, I think he's forced to move left. And he has advisors, powerful advisors like Barack Obama, nudging him left. And he's, you know, had to do it and had to follow through on a lot of major things in the legislation that he passed in the first part of his term, you know, including student debt relief, including some of the other things you mentioned. So I think it's an interesting story of sort of practical, pragmatic politics. And I, to your question, there certainly is frustration in people who've been on losing campaigns, people who have, you know, who fought the good fight for a progressive candidate and haven't gotten him into office or her into office. But there's also this sense from progressives, some progressives who are in office, of being on the team now. And that often sort of submerges whatever frustrations they feel over not having Bernie Sanders in the White House. And they're, you know, trying to back the administration, at least when we talked to them when we were writing this book, to try to get these progressive bills passed.
Yeah, and just to piggyback for a second off what Luppe said, you know, part of how we got Joe Biden is that the progressives stood down. And what I mean is that we are not seeing a primary where, you know, there is someone occupying, you know, what we might call the Bernie Sanders lane and primarying Joe Biden from the left. And we talked to a lot of the people, you know, who at least a year or so ago seemed like they could maybe do that. And folks like Ro Khanna, Nina Turner, you know, talked about prioritizing this election and getting behind Joe Biden for at least the moment. But of course, you know, all of that, again, is kind of a pre-Gaza conversation. And I do think that, you know, we're starting to see strains in this alliance right now. And I think, you know, what we're seeing in the Michigan primary with kind of the uncommitted movement and Rashida Tlaib's support for that is kind of a perfect example that, you know, this goodwill that got progressives to help Biden heal the rift in the party, that got him a smooth sailing so far in the primary, really is, you know, at risk right now. And the frustration certainly with that issue is palpable.
Something that I think about often and in a professional capacity has a lot of my colleagues and me very worried. I just don't know what the future holds or how they move forward from here, because like you've pointed out, the first 2 years of the Biden administration was, I think, cause for a lot of celebration for a lot of progressives, especially progressives in Congress. You talk about these legislative victories, the way they could have sold them could have been more effective, the way they could have done more public education around them, especially to younger people who were key in that coalition in 2020, how they approached it could have been different maybe, but it was there. And now you're at a moment, and I think what reflects this, something you talk about in the book, is also the change in the administration for the White House Chief of Staff. So Ron Klain was known, especially by progressive groups, of being a very friendly voice, a very friendly person and approachable, who would help facilitate asks, who would run things up the chain, who would bring progressive organizations into the fold for policy conversations. And like I texted you when I got to that point in the book, Hunter, like when he left, like a lot of my colleagues were like, oh shit, what's going to happen now? And Jeff Zients is now the chief of staff, and it seems like a much different dynamic. I mean, Ron Klain was meeting with Pramila Jayapal fairly often. I mean, is that still happening? I think there was an effort that they had hoped, they hoped it would continue, but is that line of communication still open and still warm with the progressives in the White House? I just don't know.
Well, when Lupe was saying, talking about the unity task forces, I think that was one pillar of, the work that was done to forge this alliance between the Biden administration and progressives. And that was one obvious avenue that led to some of the more progressive policies on, student debt, climate, infrastructure. The other big avenue is one that we report, I think really for the first time at this level of detail in the book, and that is the Jayapal Klain connection. We talked to her, and it was a really fascinating conversation about, the constant contact they were in. Klain, when he was chief of staff, was putting Jayapal, who's the chairwoman of the Progressive Caucus, directly in touch with Biden. They had a very close relationship. And when Ron Klain left, Congresswoman Jayapal told us, she was like, "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" It sounds like, from what you've told me, Jordan, that was, a sentiment that was echoed among your friends, your colleagues in the progressive space. And, according to Congresswoman Jayapal, he sort of told her, give the next guy a chance. Don't worry about it. There was a lot of concerns about Zients, just given his kind of corporate background. And so, Klain vouched for him. And I think what we see just in the past couple weeks, Congresswoman Jayapal gave an interview with the New Yorker's David Remnick on his podcast. And it's interesting because our book wasn't out yet. I don't think Remnick had seen it. But her comments, if you've heard the interview in our book, are pretty clearly a direct reference to Zients and a pretty sharp critique of him, because she says, with the staff changes, it's like Biden is a whole different president. And that's obviously the notable staff change. And she also says that the coalition is in danger of fracturing. And, that's really the heart of the matter here as we look at 2024, right? The question for Democrats has been, who can replicate the Obama coalition, which included, white suburbanites and independents, record turnout among young people, and obviously, staunch support among minorities. And what we saw with Joe Biden in 2020 is, he actually matched and in some ways exceeded Obama's youth turnout, which I think is really counterintuitive. Trump did make some gains among minorities, but, Biden did well enough to win. What we're seeing now is Trump's gains among minorities are growing. I think one of the most undercovered and underdiscussed stories in the Democratic world and in the election generally is just how angry minorities are over Gaza. And then the story that we're hearing, pretty well is that young people are really, really upset with Gaza, with, upwards of 2/3 of them sort of expressing disapproval and indicating doubt about voting for Biden. So that coalition that, we tell the story of in this book, we outline how fragile it is and how careful it was for them to build it, is now facing an issue that, based on the polling numbers, seems almost perfectly designed to blow it all up.
Right. And I just add, I think there's also the progressive activist world is one that Ron Klain, as we understand, really took the time to understand and engage with. In the book, we tell the story of Melissa Burney, who's this activist, very passionate about the issue of student debt. And she pushed the administration on getting to student debt cancellation. She was invited to messaging calls where we hear she was lobbying on the messaging calls, which is kind of an unusual thing in a political world where usually you get on the phone, you hear the talking points, you get off the phone. And also Ron Klain would retweet her and retweet other progressives. And Ron Klain was sort of in that world in a way that at least I haven't been able to perceive Jeff Zients, trying to hold on to his contacts to the sort of public online progressive community in the way that Ron Klain clearly did. And so I think from everything we can tell, it's quite a different story. And probably explains some of the changes that we've seen.
Also a chapter that I really loved, and I think it's a chapter that only you two could do and do well, and that is the New York chapter and how this rift and how this dynamic is manifesting in New York politics. And why did you include this, and what were some of the most interesting parts of the reporting process on this chapter about the battles in Albany with Cuomo and with progressive upstarts in New York?
So, first off, thanks for the kind words. But, what I would say is that I come initially out of New York politics. I reported on City Hall in Albany for many years. And, my entree into that world coincided with Occupy Wall Street. Um, and, I think 2010 is the year that we just don't talk about enough, because basically Occupy and the Tea Party, were these two completely opposite forces um, that later I think had lasting impacts, right? And what's kind of interesting is that the Republican Party and the White House became the Tea Party, whereas Occupy, I think, philosophically had huge impacts, but I don't think they really got the concrete electoral and policy wins that they might have hoped for at the start of that movement. And I think that's important because, along with answering the question of sort of how did we end up with Joe Biden, I think our book explores something that has long been a fascination for me, which is that if you look at this country demographically, it is a young country, it is a diverse country, it is a politically liberal or left, whatever word you want to use, country. And yet we do not often get that result electorally, with, I think, Donald Trump and the current Republican House being peak examples of that, right? And so why is that, right? And I think New York is kind of a perfect microcosm of that discussion, because whether it be the fact that Bernie was born here, the fact that AOC came from here, the fact that Occupy happened here, New York has been kind of the lab and the engine of progressive politics in America, and really dating back to Greenwich Village in the 60s. There's a really long tradition of this. And yet in New York, the result is not often progressive, right? In the city itself, we have Eric Adams right now, who's, about as right wing as a Democrat can get. I think by the end, similar had been said about Cuomo, right? So diving into New York, I think, was the perfect way to explore this question of sort of why don't Democrats win and why doesn't the left win? We went on their home turf. And, what we found, there were a couple chapters in the book that deal with New York, including, we have some on the rise of AOC, which obviously was sort of the pinnacle for the post-Bernie left in terms of victory. But then we follow two of her closest friends, Yulene New and Alessandra Biaggi, and we saw how they were unable to replicate her success. And I think they ran into the same stew that Democrats and the left are dealing with nationwide. And that is, first off, Republican structural advantages, right? And on the national level, the Electoral College is obviously the biggest example of that. That is the number one enemy of majority rule in this country. I think number two is the Senate, right? Where these states that have less of a population than New York City have as many senators as New York and California do. It's just wild, right? And then also sort of the Republican advantage in dark money, right? And we saw that with, certainly Biaggi's race, where she was, running in upstate New York, and there was 10 plus million poured in that race, a lot of it painting her as sort of a defund the police radical. But then along with those structural advantages, you have, I think, the fact that the Democratic establishment is still looking to crush those on the left in many cases, and then also the fact that progressives cannot consolidate. And you saw that in both those races. Biaggi was up against Sean Patrick Maloney, who was the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and he brought a ton of money down, and he was able to crush her. Meanwhile, Yulene lost in a district that ultimately probably was a progressive one. And she lost to Dan Goldman, who's this sort of heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, almost a the left's perfect caricature of a centrist enemy. And part of the reason that Yulin lost is because there were two other progressives in that race, and they or three actually, and they couldn't all sit down and make an agreement together. And I think, we really do see a lot of that on the national level. I think a great example would be Bernie and Elizabeth Warren in the 2020 primary, where whatever leftist energy there was at the beginning of that race, it was thinned out and spread. And that was certainly a factor that helped Biden win.
And I think in New York specifically, we're obviously, we both live here, and we were fortunate that New York became so politically significant in 2020 and 2022. We had the Cuomo phenomenon, and I think it is something that's unique to Democrats. Like uh, I'm a frequent critic of sort of both sides media coverage, and like one thing I'd point to is there's no Republican Andrew Cuomo, right? There's no guy in Louisiana who gets to be a Republican governor, but actually like forges an alliance with the Democrats and makes everything kind of go kablooey on the Democrats when they have a good chance. And Cuomo really did that in New York, at least in my view. He created this redistricting commission system that kind of just doesn't work, can't work. And that resulted in the congressional redistricting process getting sort of blown up, the Democratic legislature trying to have its way, getting that thrown out in the courts, getting these new maps creating these conflicts with sitting members of Congress. So you had, like the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side congressman, congresswoman running against each other for the first time. And you had Sean Patrick Maloney, the chairman of the DCCC, bouncing a congressman out of his race. And that congressman coming to downtown, running against Yulin New, arguably splitting the vote for her. And so there's just this sort of Rube Goldberg mechanism in New York politics to frustrate progressive hopes for this state, that was built by a centrist Democrat. And I think that story and the particular, the particular collisions that it created is one of the most fascinating, and I think one of the most, sort of instructive ones that we have in the book, because it really shows you that like the granular level of American politics matters a lot, and the peculiarities of the parties matter a lot, and they're not the same. Um, so I really enjoyed covering New York, and I thought it was really significant and in understanding what's going on nationally for Democrats.
And I'm glad Lupe sort of went into more depth on New York's kind of what we call the Thunderdome redistricting chaos that emerged here, because I think one thing that's often missing um, in political coverage is just explanations of the structural stuff that really defines our politics. Whether that be the Iowa caucus and that process, which we obviously, explain along with its catastrophic collapse, or your redistricting and kind of your congressional structures that thwart majority rule in a lot of ways. And as much as we tried to get really wonky and explain that to people, we tried to do so in what I hope was a colorful and engaging way. So in New York, not only do you get this sort of like story of the backroom deal making, but it's a very, very personal one. So like when we cover the rise of AOC, we're talking about, the personal tensions on her campaign and how, she's really an introverted person, and this mega stardom that was suddenly thrust on her was really difficult. Meanwhile, it was also difficult for people on her team, including, someone who was literally like detoxing off opiates, right as that hurricane kind of came down. And then, when it came to Cuomo and these races that played out in New York in the past year, as Lupe said, we were able to report, I think for the first time, on this incredible phone call between Biden and Cuomo, where Biden apparently kept Cuomo out of the race when he was at the height of his pandemic fame. And I think that's a fascinating alternate history moment, right? Because if you had Cuomo kind of muscle into the primary and then have a sex scandal collapse. I don't know. Would we be in the Trump administration right now? Right, the second one. And then I think it's a little less high profile, but my favorite personal story and behind the scenes story that kind of emerged in our New York reporting was when Sean Patrick Maloney, again, who was the head of the Democrats' congressional campaign arm, he beats this progressive and then ultimately, and he muscles another progressive out of his district who had been an incumbent. So he's basically kicking out Mondaire Jones, challenging an incumbent as the head of the Democrats' campaign arm, which is kind of sacrilege. And then he ultimately loses, right? And to a Republican. And we were at what was supposed to be his election night party, and everything went sideways. And it was incredible because basically we could tell things were weird because first off, the polling was tight. Second off, his people wouldn't tell us where he was going to be that day, which is just like never a good sign of how someone's going to be doing. And ultimately, I guess Nancy Pelosi called him down to her war room in DC for an election night party. And if you recall, this was the 2022 midterms. The Democrats did well, but everyone thought they were going to lose. So we have this story where Pelosi is having this dinner and none of the lobbyists want to come. They ultimately beat all expectations except for New York, where George Santos wins, which was as embarrassing as it could get for the Democrats, given that the D-Trip failed to vet him, and the D-Trip chair goes down. So Maloney's down with Pelosi in D.C. We're at his party, and he's supposedly going to make remarks. So there's this television set up with this live feed of a podium at the D-Trip headquarters in D.C. where Maloney is going to, come out and make a speech. And he didn't come out at all that night. And in fact, almost every other candidate from your town council on up in his district lost. So we're watching these candidates get up and make these tearful concession speeches with this empty podium in the background, broadcasting live from Nancy Pelosi's office. And it was just like, it was one of the craziest scenes I've seen in politics. And I think it was also, frankly, like emblematic of, how much the Democratic Party stories get ignored because you saw, the shocking collapse of this one of the most powerful guys, in the House Democratic world. And Luppe and I were like two of the only national reporters there. And if we hadn't written this book, that story, that crazy scene wouldn't have gotten out at all. So I don't know. That's probably a really long way of answering your initial question, like why did we report on New York? I think there were just incredible scenes there, and I do think they really were a great way of encapsulating the larger stories.
The Sean Patrick Maloney race, and like just the way everyone was kind of jockeying for these newly redrawn seats. Getting a closer look at that was something I found really beneficial because I hadn't seen a full accounting of that. I knew it happened. I was aware of the results, but taking me in there as a reader, I really appreciate it because that's just something I generally wanted to learn more about, but hadn't gotten around to. I'm not searching for pieces on it typically in my free time, but I enjoyed that a lot because it's just not something I was going to get anywhere else. So I really appreciated it. Folks, I would encourage everyone to pick up The Truce, Progressives, Centrists, and the Future of the Democratic Party by Hunter Walker and Luppe B. Luppen. Really enjoyed it. It's a great read. Hunter and Luppe, thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything else you want to add? Is there anything else you want people to understand about the book or no?
I want them to read the book. I think we tell a lot of great stories, and the one thing I'd add, just based on that last conversation, is look out for the character of John Gramata. He's the chair of the Rockland County Democratic Party, former DSA member who kind of went mainstream as a Democrat. This amazing guy, and this detail's probably not in the book, but he was like, his shirt was half open. He had this like thatch of rich chest hair out at the party. And he sort of, in Sean Patrick Maloney's absence, became the MC of that night. And he was leading all these candidates up to kind of give their swan song to amazing guys who'd been in the state legislature, really articulate, lots of different backgrounds. And we get into who those people are, and you should look out for them too. But John Gramata himself, I thought, was this amazing sort of figure of New York politics, this DSA guy who all of a sudden has to like shepherd over the mainstream Democratic Party's semi-humiliating state loss in the midst of a national victory. It was a cool story to watch unfold, and one that we really enjoyed writing about.
Yeah, and he was actually a Broadway producer, I believe, and a quite successful one. So he might have been the best person to sort of conduct the tragic symphony of Sean Patrick Maloney's fall. I would also say, as much as we did sort of unearth new stuff about recent history, um, it is a book that I think will tell people about both 2024 and 2028. We get into how the Democrats' primary calendar changed going forward, and that didn't make too much noise this cycle, but it will be a huge deal when you have an open cycle next time, and when you sort of have the DNC reviewing the calendar with potentially several different candidates of several wings of the party, jockeying for their favored states to move up. So that's going to be the next big inter-party fight. We set the scenes and we go behind the scenes of that. And I think we also dig a ton into the character of Kamala Harris. And she's a really complicated story because, we talk about, what a pioneer she is many times over, what an absolute spectacular mess her last campaign was that left some of the people around her, even as they acknowledged, she's faced discrimination and sexism, just not feeling like she had what it takes. And even staffers saying, this person should not be president. And yet, we also got, I think, what are some early signs of her maybe finding her footing, including that apparently Vice President Harris, was a big voice in getting the Democrats to focus on abortion in the last midterms, which I think has been a real bright spot in a shaky time for them electorally. And also, we see the Biden campaign making her aide their new campaign manager. So I think, if you read this book, you're going to get a lot of gossip from the past couple of years. We've got private conversations with Obama that have never been reported. We've got, stories of all the war rooms and what have you. But you'll also get sort of a key to understanding what's coming next. So I really hope people check it out at their bookstore or their local library.
Yeah, the primary calendar fight, as you both point out, I forgot about that. Opening it up to like a new reshuffling every cycle, without the ability for states and state parties to really enact this or abide by it, just seems like they're setting themselves up for absolute chaos every cycle. I don't understand what they're doing there. It's going to be a mess.
They're bringing back the smoke-filled room, but they're also making it weirdly powerless. It's a huge circus.
Well, I love what they did this time too, because it's like they bumped Georgia up when Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger, two Republicans, actually control that. And then they were just like, nope, not going to do it, right? Which was like the most foreseeable outcome ever, right? I think that whole thing, and again, like as you were alluding to, Jordan, they've baked into the process now, we're going to review this every 4 years, because essentially, people forget this, but like the last major change to the Democratic primary calendar was 2008, and it was basically the cause of what was, a major rift between Obama and Hillary. That was sort of the precursor to the party split in 2016. And they've just like planned for themselves like the next big showdown. So, I think that's really a big story of the Democrats, that inability to kind of consolidate, and even when everything seems to be going their way, there is a bit of a tendency to shoot themselves in the foot.
It's a great read. There's so much more people will learn and discover and enjoy in this book. I can't recommend it enough. Hunter and Luppe, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people follow you and find more of your work?
I mean, that's such an open question these days, man. That's fraught. I mean, there was a time I would have said you can find me on Twitter at Hunter W. You sort of still can. I'm bunkered down over there a little bit. I'm also on Blue Sky as Hunter W. I am on Threads as Mr. Hunter Walker. Thanks a lot, Mark Zuckerberg, for that quality username. And then I'm on Talking Points Memo, where I am an investigative reporter. If you look over at Talking Points Memo, I should have a fun story in the next couple days about a woman, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. We're gonna have some fun with her in the next couple days. So tune in on TPM.
Looking forward to that. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky and Threads as NYC Southpaw. I'm on Instagram as NYC Southpaw as well, but that account's not very interesting. Just pictures of food and stuff. And I read a newsletter called Paw Prints, and I also am a lawyer. So if you need legal help, let me know.
If you listen to this episode, I think is what he's saying. He is now your lawyer. So thank you for that.
That's right. Privilege attaches when you download the podcast.
Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us, man.
Thanks, Jordan. It was a pleasure.